The herald was still singing the ninth verse of the Ascension hymn when the guards took hold of Ambassador Ruth Okafor, and I understood, one breath before anyone else in the press gallery, that the Vassarin Imperium was about to kill her in front of 10,000 worlds. I had covered 4 wars and 2 famines by then. I knew the sound a crowd makes when it has been promised something. The lucent ring made that sound, 200,000 Vassarin in their powdered shells, gold dust on gray plate, rising from their tears in a single rustling motion like wind crossing a wheat field. My camera was already running. It never stopped running. That is the only defense I will ever offer for what I did that day, which was nothing. My name is Owen Calder. I was 61 years old, senior correspondent for the Terran Wire, and I had spent 11 days on the throne world of Cathor with credentials stamped by the Office of Rights, there to witness the coronation of Envoy, ninth ascendant of the 10,000 thrones. Earth had been invited. Earth had been honored. The invitation said, above all outsider peoples. Ambassador Okafor stood on the coronation floor in the gray formal coat of the Terran Compact with her 11 staff behind her in the place of highest favor closest to the throne. We thought it was diplomacy. It was staging. The herald they call the voice of the ring finished the hymn, and the new imperator rose from the kneeling couch where his predecessor's ashes had been poured across his shoulders an hour before. Envoy was young for his line, tall even for a Vassarin, his carapace lacquered white for the occasion, and when he spoke, his ceremonial mouth and his speaking mouth moved together, which their scholars told me later is reserved for words of consecration. He said, every ascension is consecrated by a gift. The rarest gift is an ending, witnessed. The Imperium honors Earth above all guest peoples. Earth's gift will be remembered for 1,000 years. I am translating from the High Vassar. I have heard 40 different renderings of that speech since. None of them changes what it meant. The guards were already moving while he spoke. 12 of them, one for each member of the delegation in the black and gilt of the Ascension cohort, and they moved without hurry because nothing about this was improvised. The seizure was choreographed into the ceremony. The ring's great lenses had already turned toward the coronation floor. The lattice, the relay web that carries the Imperium's voice to every one of its 10,000 worlds, was already live, already wide, already framing the shot. They had sold the broadcast rights. I learned that afterward from a billing record. They had sold the broadcast rights to our ambassador's death before her ship ever made orbit. Okafor did not struggle. I want that on the record, mine, the one that matters to me. She was 68 years old, a small woman who had negotiated the water accords on Mars as a junior attaché half a century earlier, and when the guard's hand closed on her shoulder, she looked at it, and then at the throne, and she understood faster than I did. I saw her say something to her deputy, Tomas Reza. The ring's own audio caught it, and so the whole galaxy heard it before Earth did. She said, stand still. Earth is watching. They stood still, all 12 of them. 11 staffers Reza, the protocol officer Lena Park, the translator Iko Demba, who had taught me to pronounce Cathor correctly on the passage out. A communications tech named Brother Aloysius, whom everyone called Brother Al. 7 others, whose names I will give before this account is finished, because the names are the point, and the ambassador herself, in a ring of 200,000 spectators, under the lenses of the lattice, stood still. The instrument the Vassarin used for consecrated endings is called a seer blade. It is short, curved, and ceremonial, and it is entirely sufficient. The Master of Rites, an old Vizarine named Sirkal Othin with 4 centuries of ascensions behind him, performed each ending himself, in order of rank, beginning with the most junior. That is their courtesy. The junior dies first so that no one of lesser station outlives a superior even by minutes. It took 11 minutes for the staff. It took 1 minute more for the ambassador. 12 minutes, 12 people, and the ring sang the 10th verse over the bodies, and the lattice carried all of it, in full color and corrected sound, to 10,000 worlds where it was watched. The Imperium's own audience bureau would later certify by 190 billion subscribers. I filmed it. The 4 other outsider correspondents in the gallery filmed it. The Vassarin usher stood beside us and made sure our equipment was working, because to them we were not witnesses to a crime. We were guests at an honor, and it would have been a discourtesy to let us miss it. I have been asked 1,000 times what I felt. The honest answer is that I felt my hands doing their job, checking the frame, checking the levels, while a voice in the back of my skull said in a very flat tone, remember everything, because someone is going to ask. The feeling came later, on the shuttle, and it was not grief yet, it was arithmetic. 12 of us, 190 billion of them, watching. I sat with that number all the way to orbit. They did not expel us. That was the strangest part and the part the historians still argue over. The Office of Rights escorted the press pool out through the celebrant's gate with every courtesy, and at the foot of the shuttle ramp, a functionary in Coronation white presented me, because I was the senior Terran present and the protocol required a Terran hand, with a lacquered case. Inside was a medal. The Order of the Gracious Ending, First Class, struck that morning, the ambassador's name engraved in high Vassar on the reverse. Beneath the medal, folded in ceremonial paper, was a promissory instrument drawn on the imperial treasury for 12 million crowns, an honorarium. The functionary explained, through my dead friend Demba's replacement, that it was the largest gift price ever paid for an ending, that Earth should understand the magnitude of the esteem, and that the remains would follow on a ship of state with an honor guard, as befitted gifts of the first rank. He was not mocking me. I want this understood, because everything Earth did afterward proceeds from this fact. He was not cruel, and he was not gloating. The Vassarin Imperium was 106,000 years old, and it had absorbed or outlived every civilization it had ever met. And somewhere in those long millennia it had stopped being able to imagine that anything outside itself was real. The ending of 12 Outsiders was, to the Imperium, a liturgical event, a fine performance, a generous payment rendered. The idea that 12 billion humans might count those 12 as their own flesh, that the small woman in the gray coat belonged to anyone, was loved by anyone, would be missed by anyone, was not a thought the Imperium rejected. It was a thought the Imperium could not have. I carried the medal up the ramp because my hands could not work out what else to do with it. I have it still. It sits in a drawer in my home in Cusco, and I have never polished it, and I will come back to it at the end of this account, because the medal made one more journey before it was done. The Terran Wires charter ship broke orbit 4 hours after the execution. I filed from the wardroom, the full recording uncut, with a written dispatch of 900 words that I composed 3 times and deleted twice. The version I sent was the flattest of the 3. I had learned long before that when the facts are large enough, the correspondent's job is to get out of their way. The transmission crawled across the relay chain toward the compact border. We followed it home at a fraction of its speed, and so for the whole of that passage I lived in a strange suspended hour, knowing that somewhere ahead of me the recording was arriving, was being decoded, was being walked down a corridor in The Hague or in Nairobi or in Armstrong City by some duty officer whose night I had just ended. Every soul on that charter ship had seen the footage. Nobody discussed it. The galley ran on schedule. The pilot called her Burns in the same voice as always. You could have mistaken us for calm. On the 6th day out, the comms operator, a kid of maybe 25, came and found me in the wardroom and asked the question everyone in human space was about to spend a month asking, Mr. Calder. What do you think they'll do? I had covered Earth for 40 years. I knew the treaties, the tonnage ratios, the doctrine papers, the names behind the names in the Compact Defense Directorate. I knew things about the yards at Hygeia and the belt forges that I had agreed twice, in writing, never to publish. So I gave him the only answer that was both honest and legal, and it turned out to be the truest sentence I ever spoke. I said, son, I don't think they're going to do anything quickly. I think they're going to do it completely. He didn't understand. Neither did I. Not fully, not yet. Because to understand it, you had to go back 90 years to a border session nobody outside the trade ministries remembered, when the Imperium had reached out in its drowsy certain way and taken 3 settled systems off the edge of human space. Halver, New Cumbria, the Astor Reach, 60,000 colonists relocated under escort, compensation paid, esteem expressed. Earth had signed. Earth had been a single generation off its own soil then, with 40 hulls that deserved the name warship, and the Imperium had 10,000 worlds, and Earth signed. And then Earth, which the Imperium never thought about again, spent 90 years building, not loudly. There was no doctrine of revenge, no shrine to Halver, no annual oath. There was a budget line, renewed without ceremony by every compact assembly for 9 decades, called the margin. The margin held that human space would maintain construction capacity, fleet tonnage, and crew training at not less than 3 times the projected requirement for the defense of its borders, and it did not say against whom, and it did not have to. I toured the Hygeia yards in '61 as a young stringer and stood under a hull frame 1,100 meters long, one of 40 in that single cavern, and asked the yardmaster what conceivable enemy justified the expense. She was an old belter with hands like tree roots, and she looked at me for a while and said, "The one who doesn't think we're real." The recording reached Earth on the 9th day of our passage. By the time we crossed the border buoys, every human being alive had seen Ruth Okafor tell her people to stand still. And Earth, the compact, its parliament, its fleet, its 12 billion, had said publicly in reply to the largest deliberate insult ever offered our species, nothing. Not one statement. Not one recalled trade delegation. Not one note of protest. The Vassarin cultural attaché on Luna reported to Cathor, in a dispatch later recovered from the Lattice archives, that the gift appeared to have been received in a spirit of appropriate solemnity, and that the humans were likely composing a formal expression of gratitude, as the honor had clearly been beyond anything Earth knew how to answer. In a sense, that dispatch was accurate. The silence lasted 31 hours from the moment the recording was verified. I have read the minutes of those 31 hours, declassified now. The Compact's emergency executive session ran the whole of it without recess, and the record shows almost no debate about weather. The debate was about scope, and it was short, and the scope that carried the vote was the widest one proposed. Then, in the 32nd hour, Earth answered the Imperium. The answer was 11 words, transmitted in clear text, unencrypted on the Imperium's own diplomatic channel, addressed to the court of the Ninth Ascendant, and it was the last message Earth ever sent them. It said, "Earth has received your broadcast. Earth will attend the funeral." The Imperium's court linguists spent a week parsing those 11 words for layers of ceremonial meaning and concluded they were a graceful acceptance. The Imperium's military intelligence service, such as it was, spent no time on them at all. Those two facts tell you everything about what happened over the next 16 months. The ship of state bearing the 12 home crossed into compact space flying funeral colors, expecting its log shows a reception of dignitaries. It was met at the border by 4 human battle cruisers that said nothing on any channel, took station around it in a box, and escorted it to Luna at a pace the Vassarine captain found insultingly brisk. At Luna, the honor guard was not permitted to disembark. Human stevedores in dress uniform brought the 12 caskets off the alien hull in silence, and the ship of state was turned around inside 6 hours and sent back the way it came with its honorarium repacked in its own hold. The medal, my medal, the one pressed into my hands at the foot of the shuttle, stayed on Earth, but only because I had already carried it there, and because someone in the directorate had plans for it that none of us could have guessed. The funeral was held at the cenotaph of the unreturned outside Nairobi, 11 days after the caskets came home. I covered it from the press stand with 400 other correspondents. Heads of every compact government attended, and the off-world delegations from the neutral species, the Quoth and the Brie of many in the Sodality, all of whom had seen the broadcast and all of whom watched the humans that day with an attention I can only call zoological. They were trying to read us. Everyone was. 12 billion people had watched their ambassador bleed out on a sand floor for the amusement of an empire, and the planet had not so much as raised its voice, and the galaxy's analysts did not know what that meant, because nothing in their history had ever been quiet in this particular way. There were no speeches at the funeral. That was the second thing the galaxy noticed. 12 eulogies had been prepared and 11 were delivered, but the 12th speaker, the compact first minister, a gray quiet man named Aurelio Mbeki Strand, stood at the lectern over Ruth Okafor's casket for a moment, looked at the text he had brought, and set it down. What he said instead ran 4 sentences, and the sentence the galaxy remembers is the third one. He said, "We are not going to talk about what was done because everyone living has seen it. We are not going to demand apology because we have no use for one. What we owe these 12 is not anger. Anger is for people who can be argued out of things. What we owe these 12 is attendance." That word again. The linguists of 9 species went to work on it. Attendance, the orders had gone out. It later emerged, before the caskets ever reached Luna. I received mine because correspondents receive orders too, of a kind. 8 days after the funeral, in the form of a call from the Directorate's Public Records Office. A flat-voiced woman asked whether the wire would accept an embedded assignment of indefinite duration, deep transit, hazard class 1. I asked her embedded with what? There was a pause on the line that I have come to believe was the only theatrical moment in the entire human response. And then she said, "The fleet doesn't have a name yet, Mr. Calder. You'd be helping us with that." The working file is called The Procession. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I was 61. I had a granddaughter on Mars I had seen 4 times and a retirement plan involving a lake. I said yes, and I have never once regretted it, and I am going to spend the rest of this account telling you what I saw, because I was the only outside witness Earth permitted, from the first day to the last. What I saw first was Hygeia. They flew me out on a courier with my equipment sealed under bond, and they brought me up the long axis of the yard in a glass observation car, and I understood within the first minute that the tour was itself a message that would never be broadcast, that they were showing the wires man what the margin had been buying for 90 years so that someone outside the chain of command would be able to say, afterward, that it had all been real. The cavern I had toured in '61 was one of 19. The hull frames I had marveled at as a young man were the previous generation, long since launched, worked up, and salted away in fleet anchorages out past Neptune that did not appear on civil charts. What rode the slips now was the follow-on class, and the slips were emptying. Hygeia was not building the fleet. Hygeia had built it. What I was watching was the yard handing over the last 12 hulls of a force that had been laid down, commissioned, crewed, and exercised across 30 years of budget lines nobody outside the appropriations committees ever read aloud. The procession, when it formed up off Neptune in the 11th week, comprised 2,140 warships of the line, with fleet trains, tenders, hospital ships, and forge ships behind them in proportion. I will not rehearse the tonnage tables. They are public now. I will tell you the number that mattered, the one the flag staff used among themselves. The Imperium's active battle fleet, across all 10,000 worlds, massed roughly 4 times the processions. The procession's planners considered this ratio, wargamed it through 900 simulated campaigns, and assessed it as decisively in Earth's favor, for a reason that sounded like arrogance the first time I heard it and like simple bookkeeping by the end. The Imperium's fleet was an heirloom. Earth's was a tool. The Imperium had not fought a peer in 6,000 years. Its crews were hereditary, its admirals liturgical, its hulls magnificent and old. Earth had spent 90 years assuming every single budget cycle that the day after tomorrow it would be fighting something 10 times its size and training accordingly. The fleet was organized into 6 divisions, and someone on the flag staff with a cold sense of occasion had designated them corteges. First cortege, second cortege, through 6th. The flagship was a command dreadnought, 1,100 meters, Hygeia built, that had carried a hull number and no name for 2 years of trials. 3 days before departure, in a ceremony lasting 4 minutes that I was permitted to film, she was named TCS Vigil, and the 12 caskets were carried aboard her by an honor party of Marines and laid in a compartment on the center line of the ship, one deck below the flag bridge, that the crew, without any instruction from above, immediately ceased referring to by its compartment number and began calling the chapel. That detail did more to the neutral species attaché than the tonnage figures. The Sodalities observer, a creature of great age and frankness, asked the question at the pre-departure briefing that everyone else's protocol had kept them from asking. It asked, "Why are you bringing the dead with you?" Fleet Admiral Etta Cole, commanding the procession, a stocky white-haired woman of 70 who had spent her entire career preparing for a war everyone hoped was hypothetical, answered it without notes and without warmth, and her answer was the closest thing to a declaration of intent Earth ever issued. "It's their funeral," she said. "A funeral procession travels from the place of death to the place of rest. They died on Cathor. We're taking them back." Someone asked, a correspondent from one of the neutral feeds, not me, what would happen when the procession reached Cathor. Cole looked at the questioner for a moment, and the recording of that look has been studied since the way painters study light. "The funeral will conclude," she said, "with a reading of the names. We broke orbit on the 94th day after the execution. I stood my camera on the Vigil's observation deck and shot the formation as it lit its drives. 6 corteges in echelon, running lights at funeral dim, 2,000 hulls answering the helm together, and I remember thinking that, in 40 years of war reporting, I had never once seen a fleet leave port in silence. Fleets sailed to bands, to speeches, to families on the quay. The procession left the home system the way a hearse leaves a church, and every traffic controller from Neptune to the heliopause cleared its path without being asked and held the channels empty, and the last human transmission the fleet received outbound was not an order. It was some private citizen on a relay buoy at the system edge, breaking every regulation there was, keying an open mic, and reading the 12 names aloud as the formation went by at 1/4 C. The flagstaff logged the breach. Admiral Cole declined to refer it for prosecution. Her endorsement on the log entry read, "Accurate." The border crossing came in the 5th month. The Imperium maintained along its marches a chain of tribute states and client species, the accumulated debris of 100,000 years of absorbing its neighbors, and the first of these, athwart the procession's course, was a polity called the HFY Combine. 4 systems, an unenthusiastic navy of 200 elderly hulls, and a hereditary obligation to defend the Imperium's flank. Their pickets detected the procession 11 days out. Earth made no attempt at stealth, at any point in the entire campaign, which unsettled the Imperium's analysts more than stealth would have. And the Hesari government sent a frantic, formally correct challenge demanding the fleet's purpose and destination. The procession answered with a transmission that became the template for the entire war, 11 months of it, and I watched the comms officer send it from the flag bridge, and the whole text ran as follows. A single image of the 12 caskets in the chapel, the route plot of the fleet from Sol to Cathor drawn as one unbroken line, and one sentence in trade pigeon and high Vassar both. The sentence said, "This is a funeral procession. Those who stand aside from its path will not be touched by it." The HFY Combine stood aside. Their navy withdrew to its inner moorings, and their government transmitted, After 18 hours of what one imagines were lively deliberations, a short reply expressing, the phrase has entered the languages of 40 species since, condolence and non-participation. The procession passed through 4 HFY systems without slowing, without scanning a single installation, without acknowledging their existence further, and the galaxy's analysts went back to their models because empires in their experience did not behave this way, and neither did Avengers. The fleet was 9 light-years into the Imperium sphere and had not fired a shot, and somehow this was the most frightening thing any of them had ever seen. The shooting began at Sen's Gate. Sen's Gate was the first true Imperial system on the route, a garrison world, a naval anchorage, and this mattered more than either, the westernmost trunk station of the lattice, the relay web that had carried the execution to 190 billion subscribers. The lattice ran through the Imperium like a spine, 214 trunk relays linking the throne world to everything it owned. The procession's course from the border to Cathor had been drawn, I realized when I finally got a long look at the route plot, not along the shortest path, nor the path of least resistance. It followed the lattice, trunk relay by trunk relay, all the way in. I asked the flag operations officer, a precise Singaporean commodore named Anand Reyes Tan, whether the intent was to blind the Imperium's communications. He corrected me with the patience of a man who had been waiting months for someone to ask. Blinding them is incidental, he said. The lattice is the instrument the offense was committed with. The Imperium showed 10,000 worlds what it did to our people. The Admiral intends for those same 10,000 worlds to watch what follows. We're not cutting the spine, Mr. Calder. We're playing it. At Sen's Gate, the procession decelerated for the first time in 5 months, and the pattern that the next year would follow was set in a single day, and because I filmed all of it, and because the fleet transmitted my footage and its own sensor takes openly on the lattice's own frequencies as it worked, the whole Imperium watched the pattern get set too. First came the message. Every inhabited body in the system received it simultaneously. The image of the caskets, the route plot, the sentence about standing aside, and, for Imperial military installations only, one additional line, a deadline. Forces wishing to stand aside from the procession's path will be clear of it by the hour given. The hour given was generous. Cole's staff calculated each deadline to allow an orderly withdrawal at the Defender's own published cruise speeds. There was no trap in it. The Imperium's garrison commanders simply could not believe it was real. The first time, and at Sen's Gate, the garrison admiral, a cousin of the Imperator, as a third of the Imperium's admirals were, answered the deadline by quoting at the human fleet a verse of liturgy concerning the patience of the eternal and the fate of presumptuous vermin, and held his anchorage and launched his alert squadrons into a blocking cone with great ceremony. The deadline passed at the top of the hour. What happened in the 90 minutes after it has been taught ever since at every war college of every species that has war colleges, not because the tactics were exotic, but because of what the engagement revealed about the gap between a fleet that performs and a fleet that practices. I watched it from the Vigil's flag bridge, standing in the corner they had marked on the deck in tape as mine. I will tell you what it looked like to a layman, because the technical accounts exist elsewhere. It looked like a tide coming in. There was no maneuvering for advantage, no feeling out, none of the operatic exchange of long-range fire the Imperium's own war poetry had led its officers to expect. The first and second corteges crossed the engagement envelope in full formation, weathered the garrison's opening salvos with their countermeasures. The Imperial fire control solutions were 6,000 years old, and Earth had been reading those frequencies for 90 years, and took the blocking cone apart with massed, concentrated, perfectly ordinary gunnery, sequenced so that each Imperial squadron was destroyed before the next could come to its support. The garrison admiral's flagship, a 5-kilometer processional dreadnought called Throne of the Morning Tide, older than human agriculture and gilded over a third of its hull, was identified, isolated, and methodically disassembled by the concentrated fire of 40 human capital ships that never once broke formation to duel it. It had been built to awe. Nothing in its 100,000 years had prepared it to be simply worked. 91 minutes after the deadline, organized resistance in the system had ceased. The anchorage was gone, the orbital yards were gone, the garrison was gone. And then the procession demonstrated the other half of its doctrine, the half that broke the Imperium's understanding of what was happening to it. The fleet stopped shooting. Instantly, completely, everywhere. Escape pods were not pursued. The garrison's planet-side barracks, its cities, its farms, its civil grid, untouched. Imperial naval personnel in lifeboats received vectored instructions to the planet's surface and were otherwise ignored. A hospital station in low orbit spent the whole engagement transmitting its status in a panic loop and was never targeted, and when its reactor scrammed from operator error 2 hours after the battle, a human tender came alongside, stabilized it, and left without accepting communication. Then the procession turned to the lattice trunk relay, a structure the size of a small moon, the pride of the system, 100 millennia-old node of the web that bound the Imperium together and did not destroy it. Human engineering detachments boarded it, removed the Imperial cipher houses at their leisure, installed equipment of their own, and brought the relay back up under Earth's control, broadcasting inward to the next 213 relays and every world behind them. What it broadcast that first night and every night after was assembled with a discipline I came to understand was the entire point. No triumph, no commentary, no demands. The transmission, repeated on a cycle, contained the original lattice footage of the execution in the Lucent Ring, unedited, with the Imperium's own framing and the Imperium's own sound. Then the sensor record of that day's engagement, equally unedited. Then the route plot, the unbroken line from Sol to Cathor, with the relays already past marked in gray and Cathor marked at the end. And then 90 seconds of silence over a still image of 12 caskets, with 12 names rendered in human script and Highwasser both. Then it began again. The Imperium's court called it barbarian theater and ordered the citizenry not to watch. The Imperium citizenry watched. 190 billion of them had subscribed to the first broadcast, and the lattice's own metering. We held the metering now, showed the figure for the procession's nightly transmission passing 300 billion by the third month, 400 by the fifth. The Imperium had built, over 100 millennia, the most comprehensive spectacle distribution system in the history of the galaxy, an instrument for showing 10,000 worlds whatever the throne wished them to see. The throne had used it to show them that 12 humans could be bled for an afternoon's consecration. Earth had taken the instrument away and was using it, relay by relay, to show 10,000 worlds the price. The advance resumed 36 hours after Sen's gate fell. That, too, became pattern. The procession was never in a hurry and never paused beyond need. It moved at the speed of a thing that does not require luck. 16 days here, 9 days there, deadline, engagement, or capitulation, the relay taken, the broadcast inward, the advance resumed. The fleet train ran forge ships that ate the wreckage of the Imperium's gilded squadrons and printed munitions out the far end. The procession entered the campaign with its magazines full, and, in effect, the quartermaster still sight with reverence, ended the war with them fuller. At Pelstar, the second trunk system, the Imperium tried mass. The court had stopped quoting liturgy by then. The Admiralty of the 10,000 Thrones assembled the home squadrons of 9 provinces, 1,100 warships under the Lord Castellan of the Outer March, and laid them across the procession's published course. Because the procession's course was always published, that was part of the horror of it, in a formation their doctrine called the unanswerable array. The Lord Castellan transmitted a demand for parley first. It was the first time the Imperium had asked rather than commanded. The Vigil's reply has been printed on the inside cover of 3 different editions of the campaign histories. Cole authorized it personally. It read, "There is no parley with a funeral. You have the route and the hour. Stand aside from one or attend the other." The Lord Castellan held his array. I think, and the captured court records bear this out, that by then the Imperium's high command understood, in the abstract, that it was going to lose engagements, but believed that mass and attrition would tell across a campaign. That Earth's fleet, however drilled, was mortal, finite, and very far from home. That an empire of 10,000 worlds could spend 100 ships for every human ship and emerge bled, but standing as it had against every rival in 100,000 years. It was not a foolish theory. It rested on a single assumption so deep the Imperium could not see it as an assumption, that the humans, like every other species the Imperium had ever broken, would fight the way the Imperium fought, proudly, episodically, for honor and position and eventual terms. Pelstar took 4 days, and at the end of it the unanswerable array had ceased to exist as a military formation, and the procession had lost 9 ships. I am going to stop on that number because the histories race past it, and the histories are wrong too. 9 ships, 1,411 human beings. The TCS Caldera, the Iron Bell, the Meridian Sky, the Whitlow, the Aini, the Sparrowhawk, the Ostrava, the Long Saturday, the Candide. The procession's casualty doctrine was as cold as the rest of it. Damaged ships fell out to the trains, were repaired or cannibalized, crews rotated forward, but the dead were brought to the vigil, all of them, every time, and the chapel compartment 1 deck below the flag bridge grew from a room into a hold, and the nightly broadcast on the captured lattice acquired, without explanation, a second silence after the first, the new names, in human script only. Earth did not translate its own dead for the Imperium's convenience. The 12 from the Lucent Ring were rendered in Highwasser because the Imperium had made them its business. The fleet's dead were Earth's business alone. After Pell's star, the client species began standing aside before they were asked. Polities the Imperium had held for 40,000 years watched the route plot on their screens, observed that the gray line of relays already passed now crossed 2 provinces, did their arithmetic, and transmitted condolence and non-participation while the procession was still light years out. The Ben withdrew their tribute squadrons to home anchorage and interned their Imperial liaison officers with elaborate apology. The collected Ver declared their systems hospitals everyone and lit them stem to stern in the white of the Ver medical service. 2 client navies on the route fought because their treaties bound their honor. Both were given the deadline, both refused it, both were broken in an afternoon apiece, and their worlds left untouched and their wounded taken aboard human hospital ships and returned at the next neutral port. And the second of those navies, the Ascarid host, sent to Earth after the war a formal instrument declaring the engagement, Varen Shallows to have discharged all honor owed to all parties for all time, which I am told is the closest thing to a love letter the Ascarid language permits. And on Cathor, in the 6th month, the Imperator Quolan Ve, 9th ascendant of the 10,000 thrones, made his first broadcast since the coronation, and the galaxy gathered to listen, and the war entered the strange final phase that I still dream about, the phase in which one side had already won, and the other side was the only being in the galaxy who did not know it. The Imperator's first wartime broadcast ran 2 hours, in full court regalia, from the throne hall above the Lucent Ring, and it was addressed not to Earth but to his own 10,000 worlds, and its burden was that there was no war. There was, the Imperator explained through both mouths, a disturbance of the marches by an ungrateful guest people. The throne had chosen, in its patience, to let the disturbance exhaust itself against the Imperium's vastness. The losses reported were the inventions of disloyal relays, and the citizens would cease watching the barbarian transmissions on pain of the throne's displeasure. The lattice metering that night showed 411 billion viewers for our broadcast. The Imperium had 100 millennia of practice at managing what its subjects saw. It had no practice at all at being contradicted by its own instrument, in its own colors, with its own timestamps every night, on a schedule the barbarians kept more faithfully than the court kept its feast days. In the 7th month the Imperium tried, for the first time in its existence, to buy something it had broken. The embassy came out to meet the procession under hard-won neutral flags, 3 ships of the sodality carrying a Vassarian delegation of the 2nd rank. The court could not, the protocol scholars tell me, have sent the 1st rank to petitioners, and the procession, to the surprise of every analyst on the feeds, let them come alongside and receive their principals aboard the vigil. I was permitted to film the reception. I have watched my own footage of it perhaps 200 times. They met in a plain conference compartment, no flags, no honors. The Vassarian delegation was led by a magistrate of the treasury named Othix Sulven, and he was, I came to understand from the captured records, one of the only senior officials of the Imperium who had grasped the situation accurately and at speed. His own memoranda to the throne, written in the 3rd month, had used a phrase the censor struck from the record twice. They are not campaigning, they are executing a judgment. He came aboard the vigil to make the only offer his civilization knew how to make, and he made it well. Reparations on a scale without precedent, the gift price multiplied 10,000-fold. The Halver systems and the Aster Reach returned. Trade concessions in perpetuity. The Master of Rights, Sirkal Othan, and every officer of the Ascension cohort who had stood on the floor that day, delivered to Earth for whatever disposal Earth's customs required. And he saved it, correctly, for last. The Imperator's formal expression of regret, a thing no ascendant had uttered in 40,000 years, to be read from the throne and carried on the full lattice. Admiral Cole heard the whole of it without moving. The recording shows her hands folded on the table, an old woman in an undress uniform listening to the wealth of 10,000 worlds being laid out, in rows, and when Ven had finished she was silent for 11 seconds, and then she answered, and her answer is the reason I believe history will be kind to her, because it would have been so easy, in that compartment, to be cruel, and she declined. Magistrate, she said, I'm going to do you the courtesy of taking your offer seriously, because I believe you mean it, and I believe assembling it cost you more at your court than you will ever admit to me. So hear the difficulty. Everything you have offered is payment. Your civilization believes that what happened in the Lucent Ring was a transaction with a price that was perhaps set too high, and you have come to renegotiate the price. We do not hold that the price was too high. We hold that the thing itself was not for sale. There is no figure. There was never going to be a figure. What is owed is not payment. It is understanding. Your Imperium must come to know, in a way it can never afterward unknow, that those 12 people were real. And I regret to tell you, Magistrate, because you personally seem nearer to understanding it than your throne does, that after 100,000 years of your history, there is only one classroom left in which your civilization is capable of learning that lesson, and this fleet is it. Ven was quiet for a time. The recording shows his ceremonial mouth opening once and closing. What he said at the end, he said in trade pidgin plainly, which from a magistrate of the treasury was itself a kind of surrender. I will report that the funeral proceeds. Will anything stop it short of Cathor? Nothing in your treasury, Cole said. The procession stops where the graves are. That was true in the first hour. It will be true in the last. They piped him over the side with full honors, which confused the court protocolists for a generation, because the procession would not take the Imperium's money, but rendered its magistrate the respect due an honest man on a hopeless errand. The offer was published that night on the captured lattice in its entirety, together with the refusal, unedited, and the Imperium's bond markets, which had survived every war in 100 millennia, did not survive the audited text of their own treasury pricing the throne's conduct at 10,000-fold and being told there was no figure. In the 8th month, House Marenvey tried the other thing, the thing I will not soften. There were, scattered through the Imperium, perhaps 11,000 humans, traders, contract engineers, scholars of the old archives, a few hundred missionaries of various persuasions. Most imperial provinces, reading the route plot with the same care as everyone else, had quietly gathered their resident humans and shipped them, with courtesies, to neutral ports. Not from kindness, the cynic said, but as one removes flammables from a building when the inspector is coming. House Marenvey, a cadet branch of the throne holding the provinces of the Long Reef, instead collected the 406 humans in its territory into an orbital habitat at Reef Anchor, announced their custody on the lattice, and proposed that the procession's course through the Reef provinces be adjusted or the custody would conclude as the Coronation had, with the phrasing, and this is the detail that even the Imperium's own court chroniclers recorded with disgust, that the house possessed sufficient sear blades for the purpose. The procession did not adjust its course. It accelerated. It crossed the Long Reef in 19 days instead of the planned 31, and the campaign's only night actions were fought there, and its only boarding actions, and the only phase of the war in which Admiral Cole was, by the testimony of everyone around her, afraid. Not of the house's fleet. 2nd and 5th corteges took it apart in 3 engagements among the reef's brown dwarf shoals with a ferocity of tempo the rest of the war never required, but of the hostage clock, because the one thing Earth's whole apparatus could not do was stop 400 blades from falling on a habitat 11 light hours away. What stopped them was the Imperium itself. The Marines who took Reef Anchor, I rode in with the second wave. The Directorate had stopped trying to keep me out of things by then, found the human internees alive, frightened, hungry, and guarded by the house's own household troops, who had barricaded the approaches to the internment decks and were standing siege against the house's own enforcers. Their officer, a young Vassarine of no particular rank whose name in trade pidgin rendered as Keel, surrendered his weapon to the Marine captain and said, in memorized English, a sentence he had practiced phonetically off the nightly broadcast, "These are real. We were not all unaware." 406 came home. 11 of Keel's soldiers had died holding the decks against their own house. Earth recorded their names, and when the nightly broadcast carried the rescue, those 11 Vassarin names were read in the second silence, with the human dead, in human script and high Vassar both, and I am told by the philologists that this single editorial decision did more inside the Imperium's 100 millennia-old conscience than the loss of 3 provincial fleets. The throne could call Earth a barbarian disturbance for as long as it liked. Its own subjects had now watched the barbarians bury Vassarin soldiers as their own. Whole client systems went over in the weeks after, not standing aside, going over, transmitting fealty to a fleet that did not want it, and answered every such message identically. The funeral requires nothing of you but the road. House Marenvey's seat, the garden world of Corel, lay directly on the route, 4 days beyond Reef Anchor, and all 10,000 worlds understood what they were about to watch, because Corel's own Governor Castellan had ordered the hostage-taking, and his guilt was published in his own seal, on his own lattice. The fleets came up on Corel, and the deadline message went out, and here the pattern changed, and the change is why I have spent the years since arguing with anyone who calls the campaign an extermination. The message to Corel carried no deadline for forces wishing to stand aside. It carried a list of names: the Governor Castellan, the officers of his custody administration, 41 individuals, and 1 sentence. The procession will pause at Quirrell until those responsible for Reef Anchor are aboard this flagship. It is indifferent to how this is arranged. The procession then parked itself in Corel's outer system and waited in full view in silence, doing nothing, while a world that had just watched the unanswerable array and 3 reef fleets and the house's whole martial strength disassembled in turn looked up at the sky and did arithmetic. It took the nobility of Corel 52 hours to deliver their own Governor Castellan and his 41 officers to the Vigil's hangar deck in chains of their own forging. Not a shot was fired at Corel. Not a structure on its surface was scorched. The fleet held custody of the 42 for the rest of the campaign. They would be needed, though we did not yet know it, for the last day in the Lucent Ring, and the advance resumed. And behind it, Corel's nobility discovered that Earth had no further interest in them whatsoever, and that they were expected to govern their own world and feed their own people as before, minus precisely 42 individuals, and the Imperium's provinces, watching, learned the last lesson of the doctrine. The wrath was not weather. It did not fall on regions. It had a list, and the list had names. And if your name was not on it, the most dangerous fleet in the history of the galaxy would pass through your sky like a hearse past a stranger's gate. That, more than any battle, is what unmade the Imperium. You cannot rally 10,000 worlds to die for the throne against an enemy who has published, nightly, in your own language, on your network, exactly whom he has come for, and has kept his word about it across 40 systems and 11 months. By the 9th month, Imperial squadrons had begun declining to die, not defecting. There were almost no defections to Earth, and Earth accepted none, simply withdrawing, garrison after garrison, behind transmitted instruments of non-participation, until the court's writ ran, in any military sense, no further than the home array. The throne system itself, Cathor and its 6 fortress moons, and the grand fleet of the Ascendancy, the heirloom of heirlooms, 8,000 warships across 100 millennia of accumulation, recalled now from every province and massed around the seat of the 10,000 thrones for the only battle that had ever been inevitable. But the throne had one move left before the home array, and it was the one move that, had it succeeded, might have rewritten everything. And the fact that it had been foreseen, not suspected, not hedged against, but foreseen, planned for, and answered before it was attempted, is the part of the campaign the war colleges of 9 species now teach before they teach anything else. In the 9th month, the court's surviving strategists laid before the Imperator the obvious arithmetic. The barbarian fleet was the barbarian strength, the whole of it 16 months from its home. Therefore the barbarian home was naked. The Imperium assembled from the household squadrons of the inner provinces and the private fleets of the great families, a force of 412 warships under the Lord Marshal of the Wreath, and sent it out of the war's geometry entirely, a long ellipse through dead space, around the procession's flank, toward Saul. Its orders were recovered intact from the Lord Marshal's flagship, and they are worth quoting for what they reveal of a mind in extremity. The squadron was not directed to occupy Earth, or to blockade it, or to bargain. It was directed to give the humans a grief so much greater than 12 that the right of the Lucent Ring would be reduced to its proper insignificance. Even at the end, you see, they were not trying to win. They were trying to correct our sense of proportion. The Wreath squadrons crossed 1,100 light-years in 4 months and arrived at the heliopause of Saul on the 40th day of the 10th month, and there they met the thing that Earth had never once mentioned. In 16 months of open course plots and published deadlines and nightly broadcasts, the home fleet. The margin had been a doctrine of threefold capacity, and the procession had been built from one part of it, and the other 2 parts had never left the home system at all. 1,800 warships of the line, fully worked up, on cold alert at the system edge since the week of the funeral in Nairobi, waiting 14 months for a contingency that the compact's planners had assigned, the documents now show a probability of 81%, because Earth had read the Imperium the way the Imperium had never read Earth, and had known from the first hour that a civilization raised on spectacle would, when the schedule of its dying grew unbearable, reach for the largest spectacle it could imagine. The engagement at the heliopause lasted under 3 hours, and does not appear in most operational histories as a battle. The compact's official record files it, with bookkeeping coldness, as an interception. No human ship was lost. Of the 412, 11 struck their colors in the first hour when the firing solutions made the outcome legible. The Lord Marshal of the Wreath declined the deadline he was offered. Earth offered deadlines even then, and went down with the rest. The survivors were interned on Triton, treated according to the conventions, and returned after the dissolution to home worlds that no longer answered to anything. And the next night, on the captured lattice, the broadcast carried the interception in full. The long quiet sensor takes, the deadline transmitted and declined, the 3 hours, and then the route plot as always, the gray line of province from Cathar, and then a single added sentence before the silences, the only sentence in the entire war that Earth ever addressed to the Imperium's people rather than its throne. It said, "The procession did not require the household stayed with the graves." The court had sent 400 ships to teach Earth proportion. What 10,000 worlds learned instead in one broadcast was that the fleet dismantling their empire was the smaller part of what Earth had built and had been the smaller part all along, and that the humans had known the blow at their home was coming and had not considered it worth interrupting. The funeral to mention. The provincial capitulations, which had been a current all autumn, became a flood that week. It was no longer non-participation. It was something the High Vassar had to borrow a word for, and the word the relay scribes borrowed, the philologists tell me, was a human one, from the broadcasts, attendance. The last weeks before the home array were not quiet. History is never as clean as its chapters, and I set down the remainder of the ledger here because the small entries carry the doctrine as faithfully as the great ones. A consortium of opportunist raiders out of the spur, seeing an empire with its skin off, began cutting at the Imperium's defenseless commerce in the abandoned provinces, calculating that whatever happened between the giants, there was meat to be had at the edges. They took, in their second month of work, a very hospital convoy under the white. They had calculated everything except the procession's definition of its road. Fourth cortege detached 11 ships without slowing the advance, found the raiders' anchorage in 19 days by methods the Directorate has never published, and the nightly broadcast appended without commentary, a new image to the cycle. The anchorage, before and after, and the Ver convoy under human escort to its destination. And the raiders' captured ledgers published to the last entry, including the names of the 3 imperial provincial governors who had been selling the raiders' birthing rights. The freed worlds dealt with the governors themselves. The road, 10,000 worlds were given to understand, was safe for everyone, in both directions, for as long as the funeral required it. The procession would not be robbed alongside, and neither would anyone else. In the same weeks, the Office of Rights broke in too. The provincial temples, there were right houses on 6,000 worlds, and they had spent 100 millennia as the liturgical nervous system of the Ascensions had been watching the broadcasts with the rest. And somewhere in the 10th month, a right house on a grain world in the Ben Marches did an unsanctioned thing. It took the recovered gift rolls of its own province, the local names of the consecrated dead that the lucent ring had eaten across 1,000 centuries, and read them aloud in its own sanctuary, in its own evening rite with the doors open. The throne ordered the right house suppressed. The order was not carried out. The provincial garrison had declared non-participation 2 months earlier, and by the time the procession crossed the last province, 400 right houses were holding evening readings, and the senior hierophants of the inner worlds had stopped answering the office's summonses, and the oldest religious institution in the galaxy was conducting, against its own throne, in its own liturgical language, the funeral Earth had taught it. Admiral Cole was asked at a staff briefing whether the fleet had any position on the schism. The flag log records her answer in full: none. The names are public domain. And once in 16 months, the war touched the Vigil herself. At a forward anchorage in the last province during resupply, a Vassarin maintenance tender interned weeks earlier was found to be running cold. Boarding party of the Ascension cohort's last sworn dead, 30 of them, oath-bound to reach the chapel hold and undo the gift's dishonor by scattering the 12 from human keeping. They were detected 1,100 meters out. The procession's vigilance, like its restraint, was drilled, and the Marine Reaction Force took them in the dark between hulls, and it cost us 4. Corporal Aneki Visser, Lance Corporal Daniel Erdogan, Corporal Seifu Mathai, Sergeant Lucia Ferreira-Stone. I knew Ferreira-Stone. She had carried my equipment cases up the ramp at reef anchor against regulations, and called me sir against my objections. The 26 surviving sworn dead were not executed. They were held, and at the dissolution they were remanded like all the rest, and the chapel hold received 4 more of ours. And the second silence that night ran 4 names longer, and the advance resumed at the top of the hour, because it always resumed at the top of the hour. The schedule was the message, and the message did not flex for grief, ours included. That was the thing I had stopped being able to explain to the desk on Earth by the 10th month. The fleet did not harden against its losses. It had been built hard around them from the keel out. The margin had budgeted for everything, and I mean everything. There were 4 empty graves worth of room remaining in the chapel hold when the war ended, and 1,700 had been provided, and I have seen the requisition, dated 8 days after the Coronation broadcast reached Earth, and the line item reads, capacity, names, return, full provision. I dwell on these weeks because the galaxy's histories compressed them into a sentence. The provinces fell away, and the fleet came to Cathor, and the compression loses the texture of what the Imperium's last autumn actually felt like from inside the procession. Not a march of triumph, not a tightening fist, but a kind of vast, patient administration, a civilization keeping the most terrible appointment ever made and filling the time en route with maintenance, drill, internment hearings, convoy escort, archive recovery, and the nightly hour of names, as if wrath done properly were mostly clerical. As if that had been the secret all along, the one the Imperium in its 100 millennia of consecrated theater had never once suspected, that the deadliest thing a species can do with its grief is file it correctly, and keep the file open and let nothing, not mercy, not rage, not 400 ships at the home star, not 4 Marines dead between hulls in the dark, move the appointment by an hour. And in the 10th month, with the route plot's gray line reaching to within 1 province of his home sky, the Imperator Kowloon Vey broadcast again. He had stopped denying the war existed. This time he spoke to Earth directly, and the speech began as command and ended as something else. And I will quote the ending exactly, because I believe it is the hinge of this whole account. He spoke for 40 minutes. The first 30 were throne language, the eternity of the Imperium, the patience of the ascendancy, the certainty that the home array would grind the disturbance to dust against the fortress moons. Then, in the final minutes, before all his worlds, because he could not now prevent his worlds from watching anything, the 9th ascendant of the 10,000 thrones did the thing no ascendant had done in the whole deep history of his line. He explained himself. The gift was lawful, he said. The gift was ancient. 90 ascensions were consecrated so, and the gifted peoples were honored, and no fleet ever came. I am asked what was different. Nothing was different. The rite was perfect. I have consulted the masters and the rite was perfect. And then a pause that the recording preserves in full 11 seconds, both mouths still, and the last sentence, the one the galaxy keeps. If any power can hear me, tell me what the rite touched. It was not repentance. I want to be exact, after all these years, because exactness is what I have instead of forgetting. He was not sorry. He was bewildered. He had done a lawful, ancient, beautiful thing, and the universe had risen up off its floor and walked toward him with 2,000 ships, and he genuinely, in the deepest fiber of 100,000-year-old inheritance, could not find the cause. The Imperium's whole instrument of mind had no category for the thing it had cut into in the Lucent ring on the Coronation floor. He was asking the galaxy to name it for him. Earth did not answer him. Earth had said in the 32nd hour everything it intended to say in words. But I have always believed, and the Admiral, the one time I put it to her directly, did not deny it, that the conduct of the last 2 months was composed deliberately as the answer. That everything the procession did from that broadcast forward was Earth replying, in the only grammar the Imperium had left itself able to parse. You want to know what the rite touched? Attend. The home array was engaged in the 11th month, 4 days after the solstice of Cathor's northern hemisphere, in the full glare of its yellow-white sun. 8,000 Imperial warships, the 6 fortress moons, the accumulated weapons of 100 millennia against 2,102 human hulls. The procession's strength after 11 months, with its losses and its repairs, in the largest naval engagement by tonnage in the recorded history of the galaxy. The histories give it 9 hours. The flag log gives it 9 hours, 11 minutes, and a casualty figure that ought to be impossible and is simply true. The Imperium's grand fleet was destroyed as a fighting force, not defeated. Destroyed, struck from the order of existence. Its formations dismantled squadron by squadron in the order Rayaston's staff had drawn on a board 14 months earlier in Neptune anchorage, and the procession lost 3 ships. I watched all 9 hours from the corner marked in tape. I will not pretend I followed the mechanics in real time. Almost no one did, including, fatally, the Imperial admirals. What I followed was the sound of the flag bridge, and what I can testify to is this. In 9 hours of the largest battle ever fought, no human voice on that deck was raised, no order was repeated, and the only moment that stopped every console for a heartbeat was not a crisis but a signal 5 hours in, when the second fortress moon struck its colors without firing, and its commandant, another cousin of the throne, transmitted in clear, "This garrison declares non-participation. The throne's quarrel is the throne's. We were not consulted in the ring. We were not consulted in the ring." 14 months earlier, that sentence could not have been formed in the High Vassar language. The grammar had no place to stand from which a servant of the throne could distinguish himself from the throne's act. The nightly broadcast had taught 300 billion beings the grammar, one silence at a time. The 3 ships we lost at the home array were the Tsiolkovsky Belle, the Rika, and the Vigil's own escorting cruiser, the TCS Lake Geneva, which put itself between the flagship and the last torpedo wave launched by the Imperial van and was struck amidships by 4 warheads and lost with 290 souls. The chapel hold received them in the battle's 8th hour. While the guns were still working forward, and Admiral Cole went down from the flag bridge to stand in the hatchway for 1 minute by the clock. I know because I stood behind her, uninvited, and she let me, and what she said there was not for broadcast, and I have never sold it and I never will. I will say only that it convinced me of something I had doubted for 11 months, that the coldness of the procession was a made thing, manufactured fresh every day by several 100,000 people at terrible expense, each of them burning grief for fuel and keeping the burn rate off their faces because they had all understood, the way Okafor understood the hand on her shoulder, that Earth was watching, and that rage would have dishonored the dead, and theater would have cheapened them, and only precision, only the long, unbroken discipline of the route kept and the names read, could make 12 people weigh more than an empire. Cathor lay open by the morning of the 2nd day. The fortress moons had struck, or been silenced. The Grand Fleet survivors had ceased to exist as squadrons and were being shepherded, hull by drifting hull, into internment orbits by human destroyers with the unhurried patience of sheepdogs. The Lattice's final trunk relay, the throne relay itself, in synchronous orbit above the lucent ring, was boarded at noon and taken without resistance by Marines who found its priest engineers waiting in formal robes, the consoles powered down and polished, the cipher houses unlocked, and the senior priest holding out the master keys with both hands, saying, by the Marine Sergeant's testimony, nothing at all. There was no bombardment of Cathor. There was never going to be, though 400 years of imperial war poetry insisted nothing else was possible, and the throne world's population spent that night in shelters waiting for a fire that did not come. At first light on the 3rd day, the procession's landing echelons came down through a clear summer sky. I rode the 4th wave, over the objection of every safety officer in the fleet, and with the Admiral's one-word endorsement on my request. Accurate. And the 4th Expeditionary Marines secured the capital, the throne precincts, the Office of Rights, and the Lucent Ring itself against a resistance that can be fully described as follows. At the doors of the throne hall, 6 elderly halberdiers of the Ascension cohort, the ceremonial sworn dead of the Imperator's person, lowered their blades and were disarmed one by one, gently, by Marines who had been briefed for a week on exactly this moment because Earth had planned even its restraint, even its mercies were drilled. I walked across the coronation floor of the Lucent Ring at 10 in the morning, local summer, 14 months and 9 days after I had filmed 12 people die on it. The sand had been raked that very dawn, some functionary keeping the right of the floor though the world was ending overhead, and the tiers stood, empty, 200,000 seats of gilded shell rising silent into the sunlight, and the great lenses of the lattice looked down from their gantries, dead for the first time in recorded memory. My escort, a Marine lieutenant from Lagos, who had been 9 years old when the Margins budget line was renewed for the 6th decade, stood in the center of the floor and turned a slow full circle, taking in the scale of the architecture of spectacle, the 100,000 years of it. All this, she said, to need an audience. She was 26. The Imperium's own chroniclers could not have written its epitaph better. The Imperator was taken at noon in the Hall of the Ascendancy beneath the throne, where he had withdrawn with the court's remnant to await, his chamberlain testified, the fire from orbit that the poetry promised, because to the end, the one outcome the throne could imagine was the one Earth had never once intended. He was not bound. The Marines formed a hollow square and walked him out through his own palace at a funeral pace, past the portrait shells of 90 ascendants, and he did not speak until he reached the daylight at the top of the processional stair, with the human fleet's shuttles crossing the summer sky in streams, and there he stopped and looked up for a long moment and asked his guards, through the interpreter, the only question he had left. He asked, "Which one of you is the executioner?" The Marine captain commanding the detail, her name was Adeze Solano Brandt, remember it, because the answer is half the meaning of the war, looked at him for a moment, and then answered him with the absolute, bottomless indifference of a professional to whom the question is merely technical, and her answer was the truth. "We didn't bring one," she said. What Earth did with the Vassarin Imperium in the weeks that followed confused the galaxy's commentators more than the war itself had, because conquest was a category they possessed, and this was not it. No occupation government was proclaimed, no tribute was assessed, no human flag was raised over the throne precincts, over anything anywhere in all 10,000 worlds. The procession's ground forces held precisely 4 locations on Cathor: the Lucent Ring, the throne relay's ground station, the Office of Rights with its 100 millennia of archives, and the internment compound where the instruments of the Coronation, the Master of Rights, the officers of the Ascension cohort, and the 42 from Querl, were held under a guard that was scrupulously, pointedly humane. Their diets researched, Their devotions accommodated, the whole of it filmed and carried on the nightly broadcast without comment because the contrast was the comment. What Earth convened instead on the floor of the Lucent Ring, in the third week of the occupation that was not an occupation, was a proceeding. The Compact's own instruments called it the inquiry on the coronation of the ninth ascendant. It was not a court-martial and not a show trial, and the distinction was enforced by its structure, which the Compact's jurists had spent 14 months designing in a sealed annex in The Hague while the fleet crossed the provinces. The evidence would be the Imperium's own records, read aloud by the Imperium's own officials, under oath to their own gods, in their own language, on their own lattice. Human counsel asked questions. That was the whole of the human role. Question by question, document by document, the Imperium was conducted through the anatomy of its own act. It took 19 days, and the lattice metering, which had become the galaxy's pulse, showed the audience passing 500 billion in the second week, the largest sustained audience for any event in the history of the instrument, larger than the coronation, larger than the war. 10,000 worlds watched the billing office testify to the sale of the broadcast rights, with the contract dates proving the sale had closed before the ambassador's ship left Earth. They watched the protocol archivists confirm that the invitation naming Okafor the guest of highest favor and the right schedule designating her the gift had been drafted by the same office in the same week by the same hand. They watched the master of rites, Serkal Othan, 4 centuries old, answer with perfect liturgical composure for 6 days, explaining the antiquity of the rite, the 90 precedents, the honor of it, the flawlessness of his blade work, until the human council, a quiet Ghanaian advocate named Justice Abba Mensima, who never once raised her voice in 19 days, asked him the question the whole proceeding had been built to reach. She asked whether, in 400 years of consecrated endings, he had ever afterward learned anything of the beings he had ended. A name held in memory elsewhere, a task left unfinished, a person who had waited for one of them to come home. The old Vassarin was silent for a long moment, and then said that such information was not part of the rite. "I know," Mensima said. "That is the finding." "Thank you, Master." And she sat down, and that exchange, 11 seconds, no verdict, no gavel, is the clip that 500 billion beings carried away from 19 days. And the phrase "such information was not part of the rite" entered a dozen languages as the name for the whole disease. The Imperator testified on the final day. He was not compelled. His council, Earth had insisted he have counsel, had insisted the court protocols of his own Imperium be researched and honored even where they obstructed the proceeding. Advised against it, and he overrode them because he still believed, even then, that the throne explaining itself in its own hall would end the madness by sheer weight of legitimacy. He spoke as he had in the 10th month broadcast, the lawfulness, the antiquity, the perfection of the rite, the 90 precedents. Mensima let him finish entirely. Then she asked him a single question, the only question any human asked him in the whole proceeding. She asked, "When the ambassador told her staff to stand still, you were closer to her than I am to you now. What did you believe she was doing?" The recording holds his answer in full, and the 11-second stillness of both mouths before it, the same stillness as the 10th month broadcast, the stillness of an instrument reaching for a category that is not there. He said, "I believe she was performing her part of the rite with great correctness." The court remarked on it. We were, and here the High Vassar word he chose is disputed among translators to this day, rendered variously as pleased, moved, and grateful. We were honored by the dignity of the gift. She was keeping her people still, Mensima said, so that your guards would have no excuse to make it cruel. She spent the last 12 minutes of her life on it. That concludes the inquiry's questions. The findings were published on the lattice on the 40th day after the fall of Cathar, simultaneously in High Vassar, Trade Pigeon, and English, and they ran shorter than any imperial decree in the archive. The inquiry found that the offense was real, deliberate, institutional, and unmitigated, that it proceeded not from malice, which can be deterred, nor from policy, which can be reversed, but from a structural incapacity cultivated across 106,000 years to register the existence of others, and that this incapacity resided not in the person of the ninth ascendant, who was its product, but in the throne itself, in the office, the rite, the lattice, the whole architecture of consecrated spectacle. And therefore the sentence, when it came, was not passed on quoll and ve. I watched 500 billion beings discover this in the same instant. The inquiry imposed on the Imperator personally no penalty whatsoever. The sentence was passed on the Imperium, and it was dissolution, not partition. No human protectorate was erected, no successor throne licensed. The instrument, the act of dissolution, drafted in The Hague while the fleet was still crossing the reef, declared the Imperium of the 10,000 thrones extinct as a legal person. Every instrument of fealty void, every tribute obligation discharged, every client treaty dissolved, every world released to govern itself from the date of promulgation. The Office of Rights was abolished. Its archives were not burned but published. The entire 100 millennia, every right schedule of every coronation, every gift, every name recoverable of every being ever consecrated on that floor, 90 ascensions of them, and accounting the scholars of 40 species are still working through. The Ascension cohort was disbanded. Its officers and the 42 of Querel remanded to the justice of their own homeworlds. Under their own laws, Earth held no prisoner an hour longer than the inquiry required, executed no one, and the records show that of the 42, the courts of liberated Querel dealt with their former governor Castellan considerably more harshly than any human tribunal would have proposed. And the lattice, the spine, the instrument, the 100 millennia voice of the throne, was handed over, whole and functioning, every relay, every cipher house, every lens, to a consortium of the freed worlds and the neutral species, on a single condition, written into the deed of transfer in language no signatory has ever sought to amend, that on one day each year, at the hour of the coronation, on every relay of the trunk the network would carry no commerce, no spectacle, and no voice of any government, only the reading of the names. All of the names, the 12 of the Lucent Ring, the 2106 of Pell's Star and the Reef and the Home Array, and every engagement between with the Lake Geneva's 290, the 11 soldiers of Kiel's detachment, who died on the internment decks at Reef Anchor holding a barricade against their own house, and then in an addendum that takes the rest of the broadcast day and will take longer every year as archives yield more, the recovered names of the gifted, the consecrated dead of 90 ascensions, 106,000 years of beings whose names were not part of the rite, read aloud, name after name after name, into the sky of every world that ever watched. The Imperium had used the instrument to make 12 deaths into entertainment. Earth's whole sentence, in the end, was to make the instrument remember. I filed 11 dispatches across those 40 days, and the one I could not file for 9 more years, embargoed at my own request, until the Directorate cleared the operational detail, concerned the metal. The Order of the Gracious Ending, first class, that had been pressed into my hands at the foot of a shuttle ramp on the worst morning of my life, and that I had carried to Earth and surrendered. It is now safe to say to a Directorate courier who met my ship at Luna with a receipt already printed. I had assumed it was wanted as evidence. It was wanted as freight. The metal had crossed back across the galaxy in the Vigil's chapel hold, the entire war, lying on the lid of Ruth Okafor's casket, and on the 41st day after the fall of Cathor, the day before the rite that ends this account, a Marine honor detail walked it into the throne hall above the Lucent Ring, and laid it on the seat of the throne of the 10,000 worlds, and walked out. And that is the only thing Earth ever placed on that throne, and the only thing that has rested on it from that day to this. The Imperium's own highest honor returned to sender, with the engraving facing up. There remained only the funeral. It had been, the Admiral had said in the first week to a question shouted across a briefing room, the entire purpose of the voyage. Everything else, the route, the relays, the battles, the inquiry, the act, had been in the precise and terrible bookkeeping of the procession, logistics. The dead of the Lucent Ring had crossed their last sky. On the 42nd day, Earth buried them, and the manner of it was the final message. And there is a reason I have kept it for the end, because I stood on the coronation floor that morning with my camera, in the place the flagstaff had marked for me 14 months and a war ago, with a square of deck tape they had peeled up from the Vigil and pressed down again onto the rake sand of the ring. And what I filmed there is the thing I will be remembered for, and the thing I would trade every other frame of my life to have never needed to film at all. The morning of the 42nd day came up clear and hot, high summer on that latitude of Cathor, the same weather as the coronation, and the Lucent Ring stood open to the sky with its 200,000 tiered seats empty by order. That was the first decision Earth had made about the rite, months before, in the sealed annex in The Hague, where they had planned the funeral in parallel with the war. There would be no audience in the ring. The Imperium had filled those tiers to watch 12 humans die. No being would fill them to watch 12 humans buried. The lattice would carry it. One last time, every relay, every world, the deed of transfer suspended for a single day so that the instrument's final act under any flag would be this. But the lenses were fixed on the floor alone, and the tiers were left in shot only so that 10,000 worlds could see them empty, rank above gilded rank of vacancy rising into the summer light, the greatest audience engine ever built standing audienceless at the hour of its last broadcast. The graves had been opened in the coronation floor itself. 12 of them, cut through the raked sand into the stone, in the exact ground where each had fallen. The compact surveyors had taken the positions from my own footage, frame by frame, a use of my work I had not imagined on the morning I shot it, and that I think about every day of my remaining life. The junior staffer's grave westernmost, because the junior had died first by the Imperium's courtesy. The ambassador's grave nearest the throne dais, where the guard's hand had closed on her shoulder. There would be no monument above any of them but a plain stone laid flush with the sand, carrying a name and 2 dates, and on the ambassador's alone, 1 sentence beneath the name. The stones had crossed the galaxy in the chapel hold too. Earth had cut them in the first month of the war, in the same weeks it was commissioning the fleet, had decided, before a single shot was fired, where this would end and what would be written there. I did not learn that until the morning of the right, and of everything I learned in 16 months, it is the fact that undoes me most reliably. The grief and the gunnery were never 2 efforts. They were one schedule, kept to the day. The honor party brought the 12 down from orbit at first light in a single shuttle, escorted by the whole strength of the procession crossing the sky in funeral order, 2,000 hulls in slow procession at the edge of atmosphere, visible from the floor of the ring as a river of light moving against the blue, and on every world of the old Imperium the same river crossed the same morning or evening sky in transmitted image, and the freed worlds turned out beneath it, and the reports that came in for weeks afterward, spontaneous silences in the public squares of species that had never seen a human being, belonged to the historians now. I kept my lens on the floor. They were carried by Marines and laid down in order, junior first, and the only sounds in the ring were boots on sand and the wind across the tiers, and faintly the drives of the river overhead. There were no rifles fired in salute. The compact had ruled that no weapon would be discharged on Cathor even in ceremony, and so the salute, when it came, was stranger and older. 2,000 ship's bells, rung once each in sequence down the whole length of the formation overhead, relayed to the floor's speakers. A single rolling stroke of bronze that took 4 minutes to pass from the vanguard to the rearmost tender, and that, the acoustics of the ring, built for the roar of 200,000, held and turned over and gave back as something the architects of spectacle had never planned for. One note, repeated, unhurried, going on and on, the sound of a thing that does not require luck. Admiral Cole read the names. She wore an undress uniform with no decorations, and she stood on the sand without a lectern, and she read from the same kind of flat print card the duty officers had used for the nightly broadcast all war, and her voice did not break and did not perform. It was the voice of 90 years of budget lines, the voice of the margin. Reading. Ayana Okunjobil, Brother Aloysius Tan, Iko Demba, Lena Park, Marguerite Deverd, Noor Haddad, Piotr Cherny, Rosalind Achebe Wong, Samuel Itoje, Tomas Reza, Yusuf Kalmar. And last alone, after a pause measured to the same 11 seconds the Imperium stillnesses had taught us all to count, Ruth Okafor, Ambassador of Earth. And then the sentence on the ambassador's stone, which Cole read once in English and did not translate because the Imperium had been given its translation already, 14 months of it. She told them to stand still, and they stood, and Earth was watching. The Imperator attended. This too had been decided in The Hague in the first month, and it is the decision the galaxy has argued about longest, and it is the reason this account exists, because I am the last living witness who stood close enough to see his face. Quolan Vey, 9th and last descendant of the 10,000 thrones, was brought to the ring under escort and seated alone, in the front rank of the lowest tier, in the seat of the throne's own box where he had sat at his coronation, one being in 200,000 empty seats, compelled by the only compulsion Earth ever applied to his person to do the single thing his civilization had never in 106,000 years conceived of doing, to attend as audience of one the grief of the people his right had touched, with no lattice lens on his face, no court around him, no commentary, no role. The cameras never showed him. That was deliberate. He was not part of the broadcast, because spectacle was the disease, and Earth would not administer it even as punishment. But I was on the floor, and my eyes are not a camera, and I watched him through the whole reading, and I will tell you what I saw. And you may make of it what the galaxy is made of it, which is everything and nothing. For 11 names he sat in the perfect ceremonial stillness of his line, both mouths closed, a portrait shell of an ascendant. At the 12th name he leaned forward very slowly and placed his hands flat on the balustrade of the throne's box. In the posture, the Office of Right's own published archives would later confirm it, and the philologists have written volumes, that the oldest liturgies of his own people was reserved for a debtor before a creditor whose debt cannot be paid in any coin. There is no record of it but my testimony. He held the posture until the bells finished, and the graves were closed, and the river of light overhead began, ship by ship, to climb away from his world. Whether it was understanding, I cannot say. I have given up claiming it was. The honest record is only this, that a being whose whole inheritance was the inability to see, sat alone in the wreck of the engine that had manufactured that blindness for 100,000 years, and watched 12 real names go into real ground and bent forward under some weight. The inquiry had found that he was the product of the throne and not its author. Earth sentenced the author. The product it left alive, on his own world, in his own palace above the ring, uncrowned, unguarded after the withdrawal, unmolested by the freed worlds, who could not decide whether he was monster or artifact and settled with time on artifact. The last specimen of the oldest dynasty in the galaxy, kept by history the way a museum keeps the instrument of a famous wound. The procession left Cathor's system on the 45th day. There was no garrison left behind, no resident commissioner, no treaty port, nothing of Earth's at all, in all 10,000 worlds, except 406 repatriated civilians' worth of gratitude, a deed of transfer, a published archive, an annual hour of names on the lattice, and 12 flush stones in the floor of the lucent ring under the care of wardens nobody appointed. Keel's soldiers, the survivors of the internment decks at Reef Anchor, who had asked the departing Marines for nothing except instruction in how the sand should be kept and who rake it still, in the old rite of the floor around the stones every dawn. Their order has grown. It accepts any species. The freed worlds call them, in trade pidgin, the standing still. The fleet came home across the same provinces it had crossed going out, and the client species in the freed worlds turned out in their skies to watch it pass, and it acknowledged none of them because the funeral was over and a hearse going home is just a vehicle. At the border it dispersed, cortege by cortege, to the anchorages past Neptune, and its crews went back into the population of a species that had characteristically already begun arguing with itself about whether the whole thing had been right, whether dissolution was liberation or merely the largest sentence ever passed, whether the inquiry was justice or the most sophisticated act of vengeance in galactic history. I have sat on the panels and heard every position. I no longer take one. I am a correspondent. My position is the record. But I am also an old man now, the last of the press pool of the Coronation, and I am permitted at the end of the account one paragraph that is not reportage, and here it is. Every year on the day at the hour, the lattice goes quiet across what used to be the Imperium, and the names begin. I have listened from Earth, and once, in my 80th year, I went back and listened from the floor of the ring itself, standing on raked sand among the stones with the standing still at their dawn work around me, and the reading lasts the whole turning of that world now. The recovered names of 100,000 years going up into the summer sky, one after another, each of them a being who was real and was not seen, and it has never once in all the years sounded to me like victory. And the one time I said so aloud, the old warden working the rake beside me, four-jointed, gray-shelled, who had held a barricade against his own house before half the galaxy was born, answered me in his memorized, careful English, without stopping his work, and I have decided his sentence is the last one this account needs, because Earth spent 2,000 ships in 16 months, and the whole cold treasury of its grief to teach one empire one fact, and the rake in that old soldier's hands is the proof the lesson took. He said, "It is not victory, Mr. Calder, it is attendance. That killed our 12 had an audience of 190 billion, and we did not execute its emperor, and we did not burn its worlds, and we did not take its treasure. We took the audience. We taught 10,000 worlds where to look, and what they watch now, every year forever, is the names." Envoy lived another 60 years above the graves of the people he consecrated, the last of his line, in the deepest silence any throne has ever earned. And when he died, the standing still raked the sand that morning the same as every morning, and the lattice did not interrupt the reading. There was no room in the schedule. The schedule belongs to the dead, and the dead at last are seen, and that, write it down, whoever keeps the record after me, that is what it cost to make a spectacle of Earth's grief. Everything, except what we buried, which was never for sale.